All right, well, everybody, welcome to the CSN DART, or Data Analysis and Reporting Tool webinar for CSN Data Validation. Joanne Rice. We're going to have the training provided by both Nikki Young from UC Davis and Jennifer DeWinter from Sonoma Tech. I have one introductory slide that we'll go to next. I think, Jennifer, you're controlling the slides, right? Yeah, great, thank you. So I just want to give everybody a quick update just on the status of DART and what we're doing right now on our plans for DART in the coming year. We did a lot of development over the past few years in DART, getting all the different tools designed and implemented. And so for this year, for FY19, we're basically in maintenance mode for DART, which means that we're fixing bugs and other software issues as they come up. We answer users' questions through the CSN support at sonomatech.com email link, and then updating the general DART users guide for CSN, and logging changes and potential changes and recommendations from users for the next iteration of our changes as we plan for FY 2020. So if folks have things come up that they'd like to see, please email the CSN support at sonomatech.com email link, because then put that on the list of things. Again, folks, if you can put your phone on mute when you're not talking, that would be very helpful. Thank you. So we'll be logging those things for changes to come for FY 2020. So if you do have something that you see in DART that you would like to see maybe changed, updated, or added, please let us know. So, and again, you can reach the entire CSN team, which is UC Davis, Sonoma Tech, and EPA at the email link at the bottom of the slide. So, all right, Jennifer, I guess are you first, or is Nikki first? As far as presenting.
I'm first.
Okay, take it away.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki from UC Davis, or Dominique, as you'll see on the email. I know recently a lot of new people are starting to validate the data, so I apologize for the first few slides to those. I've been doing some validation for a while, but just wanted to give some background on the CSN, kind of giving the big picture context for the validation that we all do. So the EPA established the CSN network as part of the PM 2.5 NAAQS review in 2000, and it's a routine monitoring network, predominantly in urban areas, to get speciation PM 2.5 data and chemical composition over a long time period to better understand air quality and human health concerns. We have a fluctuating number of sites, but this is a relatively up-to-date map of all the sites that we have across the U.S. and other locations at the moment. The red dots are the primary sites, and then there's about 6 sites that have co-located samplers. There's also special studies and other sites going on, but roughly we have about 140 sites on sites at any one time. So each of these sites, Jennifer, if you could change to the next slide. Thank you. For each of these sites, we have 2 samplers. There's the MET1 SAS and the URG. And for those 2 samplers, there's 3 filters running. There's the PTFE and the nylon, which is sampled in the SAS. And then there's the quartz filter, which runs in the URG. The filters run for 24 hours for the samples, and they run every 3rd day or every 6th day, depending on the sampling site frequency. And then we should have field blanks running once a month at every site, and there's 1 of each filter type. And so next slide. So this is just a quick overview of the data pathway and the validation process, and we'll go into some more of the details later on. So this is kind of a fairly simplistic view. But from those samples that are collected in the field, we have the operator noting down sampling conditions and the operating values. And they send the filters, so both the field blanks and the samples, back to Wood, the filter shipping and handling lab. At Wood, they input field sheet data into the database to make the data electronic, and then they also sort out all the physical filters and ship them off to the lab. So we currently have RTI and UC Davis analyzing the filters for speciated data, and would also send to UC Davis the electronic files, so all the operating conditions from the field. Once the filters have been analyzed, we collect all the data at UC Davis and we process the data into concentrations, and we also apply flags and null codes and other situations to the data. We format it in a way that's good for reading in Dart. So Dart, as you hopefully all know, is the data analysis and reporting tool. And it's there that the state, local, and tribal validators yourselves are able to review the data, make changes, use local knowledge to validate the data, and obviously that's going to be the majority of the rest of the presentation, so I'll keep that one short. But just to note that it is the SLTs that own the data, so you're responsible for how the final data actually look and make final decisions on whether to make any changes. Once the validation window has closed in Dart after 30 days, it gets returned back to us at UC Davis. We review the changes made, and then again we process and format into a readable format for AQS, and we deliver to AQS. So data validation occurs at multiple levels through that pathway, and the purpose of the data validation is to hopefully identify and catch potential problems such as contamination, sample mishandling, instrument malfunctions, and analytical problems. So we have lots of data to look at. Some people only have one site, multiple sites, but hopefully you can review a lot of data in Dart. So there's many tools and automated processes that occur along the way. So this is why it's important to really review the data to make sure that there's nothing erroneous happening in the data set. So moving on, just to kind of give you a bit more information about each of the measurements that we actually have. So going from the 2 samplers that we have in the field, the 3 filter types, there's also 3 different types of analyses that occur. For the PTFE filters, there's X-ray fluorescence analysis performed to obtain information on elements. The nylon filters are analyzed by ion chromatography, and that's to give us 6 ion species. And then finally, the quartz filters are analyzed by thermal optical analysis to give us various information on organic carbon and elemental carbon. So on the next slide is the full list of all the species that we obtain and we analyze for. Just to note, there are a couple of differences between the list that you'll be able to see in analysis parameters that you'll see in Dart versus what is delivered to AQS. And there's predominantly a difference between the number of carbon parameters that you'll see. I'm trying to separate them out here on the slide so you can see. It's just an OC and EC that you get in Dart, and then any flags or invalid filters on the concentrations will be propagated to the carbon fractions, which will also go to AQS. On the next slide, for a given filter, not only do we get these ECs, so say the elements for the Teflon or the PTFE filter, we also get additional information from the field. So we call these operational parameters, such as ambient pressure, ambient temperature, flow rate CV, and sample volume. Just to note that the ambient pressure and temperature, 2 things here. These, when it comes to how they're reported, the SAS, so both the Teflon and nylon temperature and pressure, are actually reported as a Teflon-only parameter in AQS. That's just one thing to note. And then the other thing is that these are actually values that are recorded in the field as being average ambient pressures and temperatures. This is not the same as taking the average of the minimum and maximum reported temperatures and pressures. So just be aware of that one. It's a small difference, but noteworthy. These are all taken per filter type, other than the one I just mentioned. We then have some additional information that we provide in Dart to aid validation, and these are primarily calculated parameters such as ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, unit mass by carbon, soil, and reconstructed mass. We also, so that's per sampling event, we also provide the mass from NLTech. You should be able to, hopefully if you've got an NLTech account, pull this data yourself if you want different types of data, different periods, but we provide that per sampling event where available as well to help aid validation. And then finally, we also provide transport temperature values, and this is per filter type. And this is predominantly so you can check the value against the application of one of the qualifier flags. But that value does not go to AQS. So on the next slide, I've alluded to some of these flags already. So there's kind of some nuances relating to CSM flags that I use. I'll hopefully try and break it down a bit, open up the world of CSM flags. There are two main types of flags used in the CSN. There's the qualifiers flags and then null code flags. The qualifier flags can sometimes be referred to as validity flags because they're only applied to cases where the data are marked as valid. So these are typically informational, can provide information on local conditions, sampling abnormalities, and instrument discrepancies, just to name a few. And then null codes invalidate the data, so it could be something as small as just the value was not recorded, so it's invalid because we don't have a value. But it can go all the way up to power failures, instrument malfunctions, or the sample, the filter got lost, so there's no data for that one. Not only are there these two types of flags, we also have different application types. So again, we can go from the parameter-specific application all the way up to a whole sampling event. So the parameter-specific can depend on the values. So one common flag is the MD qualifier, and it's applied based on the concentration value and whether the value is below the minimum detection limit. So that's per parameter and per analytical species, to be more specific. It can then apply to all the analytical species, so it could be all of the elements or all of the ions, for example. And this typically happens when something occurs during the analysis phase. So perhaps the Teflon filter was dropped in the lab, so we want to pass on the information that this happened by way of applying a qualifier to an end user. Perhaps something happened to all the operational data. It wasn't recorded properly. So again, we might want to apply a qualifier or a null code, but again, could be parameter specific and not necessarily full operational parameters that are provided per filter type. Finally, a whole filter. So
Nikki, hang on one sec. So I can hear like some background noise, and I hate to be nag, but it'd really be great for folks to put their phone on mute, even if they're on a cell phone, if they're not speaking, because that would be a big help to us. So thanks again. All right.
thanks, Joanne. So yeah, whole filter. So this would include both operational and analytical species. So for the PTFE, it would be all of the elements and all of the ambient pressures, temperatures, flow rates, UVs, all of the parameters associated with that filter. Finally, a whole sampling event. So this would be all filter types, all three filter types from a particular day. So analytical species and operational parameters for each of the three filter types. Know that the application of these flags, on some of them may depend on certain criterion value ranges that are acceptable by AQS, for example. And the application sometimes can be manually performed, but at least at UC Davis and at Wood, when we have these allowable criteria for value ranges, we'll have automated flagging set in place. So it's important to review all flags to confirm the application. So just one final thing about these two types of flags. AQS will only allow null codes or qualifier codes. Qualifier codes are applied to valid filters only, or valid data only. Furthermore, AQS will only allow one null code at a given time, but will allow up to 10 qualifiers if it's a valid sample. So that's kind of my bit done for now. Jennifer will hopefully describe how all of this can be seen in Dart and some more specifics on how to do your validation in Dart. Over to you, Jennifer.
Great. Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer DeWinter at Sonoma Tech. And as Nikki mentioned, I'm going to spend the next few slides talking a little bit about the screens and tools that are available within Dart, which is the data analysis and reporting tool. And then we'll jump back over to Nikki and she'll give some good insights into, more detail on the analyses performed by UC Davis and some examples of some of the issues that can pop up in the data, and then what you all can be looking for and reacting to when you're seeing it in Dart. So just a bit of an overview here of the CSN data flow to and from Dart. And this is sort of a zoomed in perspective on the earlier graphic that Nikki had shared about the overall flow of data between all of the organizations and kind of from collection in the field all the way to AQS. So once all the data have been organized and compiled by UC Davis and their analyses performed, then they format up the data and send it over to Dart. Once the data are ingested to Dart, the state and local and tribal validators then are informed electronically that you have new data available. And we tend to refer to these as sort of batches of data. So that's something you'll commonly see within Dart and within our emails. And this triggers the first email letting you know that new data are available. And that opens up the 30-day review window where data are available within Dart. You'll receive a second email when there are 2 weeks left in that 30-day window, and then finally an email when there's 1 day remaining. And within that 30 days, that's where the time is critical for all of the validators to log into Dart and review the data, certainly reviewing the flags that have been applied by UC Davis. We'll get into some of the specific examples of flags that are commonly seen, as well as some where UC Davis has specifically requested, a second look by validators. And the tools in Dart, enable you to review and approve the data, make changes to the flagging, and then also leave comments for the lab. And then finally, at the end of that 30-day window, the data are returned back to UC Davis, who then, address any changes that may have been requested during the validation process, and ultimately then get the data uploaded into AQS. So, one of the main things, obviously, for accessing the data within Dart is having an account. And Dart is a tool that's available within the AirNow Tech web application. And, most of you already have accounts. And this is just a bit of a reminder that if you have new validators in your agencies, one of the first steps for getting them ready to use Dart is to request an AirNow Tech account. And that can be done via the login screen in AirNow Tech. And the second step there is to then send an email to us at the csnsupport@sonomatech.com email address and just let us know that, you have a new validator in your agency, what their account information is, and then we can make sure that they have Dart access available to them so that they can see their CSN data when they log in. And a lot of you have definitely been great about keeping us informed as you have new validators, folks leaving and folks joining your agencies, so that we can keep our contact lists up to date and make sure that you have access to the data. So please do that if you can, and we'll try and make sure that then everybody can access the data as they need to. And so Dart's tool that's available under the Tools menu in AirNowTech. And once you click on Dart in the Tools menu, you can navigate over to this Dart home screen. And there's really two areas within Dart that are used for the CSN program. So one of those screens is the Manage page, and that's what I'm showing here. And this is the screen that displays all of your data sets that are available. You'll typically, for CSN, have one table at the top, which includes the data sets that are your CSN data for your agency. And then you may have a table at the bottom with other, personal data sets that you've uploaded. But focusing on the table at the top here, you can see some information about the CSN data set within Dart. You may have multiple rows in the table, like in this example, where this is for an agency that has multiple CSN sites. Some of you may only have one. And then each row corresponds to each CSN site. And so you can see the date range of data that are available in Dart, which, goes back multiple years now. You also have options for downloading your CSN data. And on this download column, you can download data in either a CSV format or an AQS format for either the most recent batch of data or for all of the data that are in Dart at this point. So some folks do, download data out of Dart and do validation, either in addition to Dart or in, separately from Dart. And that's a good way to go too. I think just making sure that any comments or changes get back into Dart and pass back to the lab is important there. And then finally, this approval status column is used to tell you whether you have a new batch of data that are awaiting approval still, or if you've already approved the batch, you'll see the green check mark. And then finally, once that 30-day review window has closed, you'll see the locked batch symbol. And once you click the symbol, it navigates you into what we call approval mode, which is where the validation process occurs for CSN. And so that's what this screen is showing, is Dart's approval mode page. Each of these web pages are specific to one CSN site, which you would see at the top here. We've just grayed out the AQS code for this site. Some important pieces of information here on the top portion of this web page include the batch of data that you're looking at. So you see when the batch became available in Dart, and then when the end of the 30-day review window is. And I wanted to mention this specifically because we've had in recent months a few, two, actually maybe even three, active batches in Dart at one time. And so when you enter approval mode, this enables you to look at other active batches, or inactive really, but certainly the active ones are important to take a look at. So you can do that either by toggling backward and forward with these arrows, or you can use the select batch button and then, query which time period of data you need to look at. So, and then below that information, we have a summary table that describes the samples that were provided from the lab for this batch of data. So you have a summary of flags that were applied at the top here, and then for each sample date, you can see some information about qualifiers and null codes, as well as data completeness in this first column. So this table, provides you something of an overview that you can use to help prioritize your validation. So if you see samples with, a lot of flags applied, or flags that you don't typically see applied, those would be good to take a look at. Certainly looking at samples where null codes were applied are important to look at as well. And then below that table is where we have what we call the batch data table. And this really provides you all of the results from the laboratory for this batch of data. And this is the table from which you can, edit your null and qualifier codes, edit values for some of the parameters, and review and leave comments, either for the lab or, for others in your agency. And so we've called out specifically here that the two columns where the null or qualifier codes show up for each of the parameters on a given sample date. And these are buttons that then you can click to open what we call the edit batch window. And that's where your edits for those codes and those flags are done. And so this is what the edit batch window looks like. And so when you first come into it, the editing is set up for the selected row in that table. So for this sample on February 2nd, and this parameter here, which is one of the operational temperature parameters, you'll see that that's the sample date here, and that's the parameter that's showing up in the preview. But you have a few other options for editing if you want to apply changes to more than just that one selected species. And so that's what this drop down at the top can be used for. There's a few options in this drop down, either making edits to that selected species, to the entire sample, or to the analytical parameters for any one of the different filters. So it's important to, make that selection for what you need to edit. And then below that, you have your two drop downs for null codes and qualifier codes. And below that, then you have a preview of what your data looked like originally before you apply this change, and then what it will look like after you apply this change. And you'll see the parameter name, and this one happens to be a bit long because this is one of the operational parameters. But at the end of the parameter name, you see two little brackets, and the first bracket is showing you if there are any null codes applied, and the second would show you if there were any qualifier codes applied. And so in this example, the validation needed is to apply a null code here, in this case AN, indicating that there was a machine malfunction influencing this temperature parameter. And so after this change is made, you'll see that AN null code show up in the preview here. And then one thing that we wanted to note was how important it is to leave a detailed comment about the change, so that when Nikki and others at UC Davis get these data back, they can understand why the change was made, and especially if there are any other actions needed on their end. It's really helpful to have a clear comment about what the intention was. And so this is an example of a comment explaining why that AN null code was applied to the temperature parameter, calling out that it's only intended to be applied to...
Oh, we got to be on the same page here. What is it?
We can hear somebody talking in the background pretty loudly, so if you don't have your phone on, can you please do so? We'd appreciate that.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks everyone for staying muted. And so this comment is especially helpful because it calls out that this change is only intended for the Teflon filter because of the issue with the temperature sensor. And so that can be really helpful for the lab to know, to make sure that they understand that you only want your change for one parameter versus if you need to make the change for all of the analytical species for that sample date, or if you actually do want to apply it to all of the operational parameters as well, which is good to call out because DART doesn't have an option for applying to operational parameters in group. So that's really helpful to include in your comment. And then just sort of a few reminders here, which I know many of you are familiar with and do already, and that using the edit batch window can be done by clicking on that icon in your batch data table. And here are the options in the second bullet for what groups of parameters that you can make changes to, including the selected species, all species for the selected sample, or the analytical parameters for a given sample. And that would only apply to the analytical parameters and not the operational ones. We have it on our list to potentially add options for including operational parameters there as well, but we haven't developed that yet. And just a reminder that in that window, and I didn't really talk about it, but there are options here at the top, and we call this something of an advanced option. If you need to make changes that apply to multiple sample dates, you can add dates here as well. And then you'd see multiple dates show up and multiple dates appear in your preview if you needed to do that. Oh, here's that example. So clicking this would open up a bit of a little calendar here where you could select multiple sample dates to edit at one time. And then just a few other reminders about editing, and I think Nikki covered this first bullet already, that a sample can only have a null code or qualifier codes, but not both. Only one null code and then up to 10 qualifiers are able to be provided to AQS. Sometimes that's a sort of gotcha that can happen within Dart, is just remembering to remove qualifiers if you need to apply a null code, or vice versa, since you can't have both. Another requirement is that if a parameter value is missing, which for you would display as a -999 value in Dart, there must be a null code applied. And so you may find sometimes you were trying to remove a null code, but it couldn't be applied in that case because a missing value has to have a null code. And then certainly the last bullet there is important, that if you, with your knowledge of what was going on at a site, have more information than was available to the lab about the circumstances that resulted in the data being invalid, certainly applying a more specific null code is a great thing to do. Especially if you see that miscellaneous void, that would be a time or, a scenario where selecting something more appropriate would be beneficial. And then this slide is just showing you a few of the parameters for which you can edit the value in addition to the null or qualifier code. And that can be done through the batch data table as well, by clicking on the values that show up as buttons here. And that's an available function for the operational parameters, where something may have been, misrecorded on a sheet. And so if you have the correct value, you could update it here, and then that can get back to the lab. And then just real briefly, kind of highlighting the graphical review tools that are available, including the time series, which is shown here, which is pretty essential for doing data validation, and that's available right below the batch data table. There's the scatter plot, and the scatter plot in Dart defaults to a comparison of the sulfur and the sulfate, which is also performed by UC Davis. So if you're wanting to take a look at the data and understand this evaluation, you can use a scatter plot for that. And by default, this scatter plot does apply a multiplier to the sulfur. So it's, and that's a function that you can access and change as far as what that multiplier is using the plus menu here. I just wanted to call that out, that's an available option for you. And then you have the stacked bar chart showing you, it defaults to showing you the calculated parameters that Nikki mentioned for each of your sample dates in this batch. One of the additional parameters that is plotted here is the difference in mass between what was measured and reconstructed. Measured if you had a co-located instrument with PM mass that was available in AirNow for use by the lab, and then the reconstructed that's calculated from the CSN data set. There's also a fingerprint plot, which is a way to take a look across all of the parameters for a given sample date and then thumb through those to see if you're seeing consistent patterns, across your parameters and dates. And then finally, you have the map available, which is useful in the sense that you can take a look at other CSN sites within the network. So for areas that are, located nearer to other CSN sites, that can be a helpful validation tool. And this defaults to showing you the sulfate parameter, but you can change which parameter is displayed and then toggle back and forward between your sample dates. And one question that came up recently was about some of the CSN sites that may have been inactivated, and those do still show up on the map at the moment anyway. We haven't changed that, but the reason they show up is because you can go back and look at old samples. So then you have access to sites even if they are no longer active. And then this slide is just highlighting some of the suggested DART practices that we've come up with that are, helpful in DART, but certainly helpful for making sure that the data are valid and that information gets back to the lab that's relevant for them before they submit it to AQS. So taking a look through all of the comments that have been left, certainly the field information, chain of custody, for any potential issues that either have a flag applied or may need a flag applied. As I mentioned, taking a look at that summary table can help to sort of prioritize which samples, to look at, since there is a lot of data to review. Just a reminder that you can filter and sort that batch data table to help, find the samples that either have flags or have, a comment left for you. Taking a look at especially incomplete samples is always a good step, as well as your outlier values. We have a pretty long record now of data within DART, including what's come in, from UC Davis, but also a backfill of data from AQS for, years prior to that as well. So taking a look at trends over time and, what was occurring at sites for similar time periods in prior years can be a valuable thing to look at in the validation process. And then, as I mentioned, definitely leaving a good comment with, extra detail as possible for any changes made is really valuable for then the next step after the data leave DART and go back to the lab. Okay, so I'm going to pass it back to Nikki now to talk, more specifically about some of the flags that are applied that you commonly see and what the analyses are behind them.
Thanks, Jessica. Yes, I'm just going to start with this horrendous-looking table and get it out of the way quickly, but hopefully you'll be able to refer back to it later. Just because, as I said, we've got a lot of data and we've got a lot of specifics. So we do have automated flagging in place, but also just so that you're aware of some kind of constrictions that we have when it comes to delivering data to AQS. So some of these are parameters that we have particular criteria for whether we apply qualifiers or null codes to, depending on the severity of the parameter's value. So just a few things to point out here is that we have ranges that differ between what is allowable, kind of something that we want to flag and highlight as being a potential erroneous value versus something that AQS will not accept if it's an extreme value. And then there's differences between the two types of samplers as well. So meaning for the URG, the quartz filters will have different criteria for compared to the SAS, so the PTFE and the nylon filters. So just to go through one of the examples listed here for the average ambient temperature parameter, in the case of the quartz filter, the operational manual suggests that if the ambient temperature is recorded as being outside of minus 20 or 45 degrees Celsius, then it's not necessarily an accurate value that's recorded. So outside of these ranges, we'll apply the QT qualifier, which is a temperature sensor questionable qualifier. However, if the value is lower than minus 40 or higher than 55 degrees Celsius, then the value will not get into AQS. So we have to apply a null code in order for that record to exist in AQS. So hopefully some of those criteria you can see, and you might see cropping up on some of the data. But they're kind of easy numbers to refer to and mostly apply to the operational parameters, but then the application of those can actually depend on the specific case. So for average ambient temperature being out spec, then typically gets applied a qualifier or null code to just that parameter. When it's something like the sample flow rate being out of the allowable ranges, then the null code will get applied to all the analytical species as well as most of the operational parameters, except for potentially temperature and pressure. So just something to be aware of, and we are changing some of the applications of these flags because it might not make sense, for example, for a flow rate issue to affect things like the temperature sensor. So just moving on away from this table to some of the examples that we do see in Dart coming out quite a bit on questions. So I can go to the next slide. So we have common flags that require action, or at least we want to highlight them to you for review in Dart. And then I'll talk about some that don't require action and why they don't require action. So there's the A1 and B1 flags. These are not true AQS qualifier flags, but they are listed and available in Dart. And these are to highlight changes that have either been made at Wood or here at UC Davis. So we'll indicate that changes have been made, and so the data that you're reviewing in Dart may actually be different from what you may see on the field chain of custody. So that flag will be on the data and at the summary at the top of the page that Jennifer showed in Dart. So you can maybe zoom in on those samples and kind of mark them off as being an acceptable change or not. We also have the C1 flag, which is manually applied by us here at UC Davis. When we're going through data, there may be some data that catches our eye, and we try and reach out through Wood to the site operators to resolve some of these issues before the data get into Dart, but it's not always possible to resolve these issues, and especially as it could be atmospherically real, and it just looks unusual to us, but we don't have the local knowledge of maybe some unique event occurred at the site on that day, so the data is unusual compared to historical data. So we will apply this flag manually, and then we'll leave a comment explaining why we flagged it, and just again for review, it could be completely fine, but no, it is applied manually, so not every unusual circumstance will get picked up on, and it could be atmospherically real. We just don't have that local knowledge, which is why we're passing it on to you for further review. And finally, one that kind of requires action is the transport temperature out of specs qualifier, the TT flag. So I said before, we provide the temperature value to you in Dart, and this is the receipt temperature at Wood, and if it's greater than 4 degrees Celsius, the TT flag will be applied. So it's just confirming that the flag has been correctly applied, if the temperature is more than 4 degrees C, and that's as far as the value goes. It does not get delivered to AQS, which is why it's important to check whether the flag has been applied correctly or not.
We got a question on the chat. Do we want to go these for the end, or do we want to try to do them as we're going?
We can do it as we're going if it's making sense on a particular slide.
Yeah, there was a question from Jason Crudel about the minus 20 degree, it must have been on your previous slide, temperature spec, and he was saying that he confirmed that they were greater than minus 20 degrees and that they removed the flag and actually applied a Z flag to say that it was real, and his question was, is that the preferred approach?
Yeah, so we actually noticed this when we're reviewing the January data, and I guess the bottom line is that it's you guys that own the data, so if that's what you'd prefer to do, that is absolutely fine. I don't know in terms of consistency across the network whether you want to take that into consideration, but just one thing to know is that if the value is if it's for the core filter, if it's lower than minus 40, then we do have code set in place to overwrite the qualifier and apply the null code instead so that that record gets into AQS. I don't know if that helps, Jason.
Yep.
Okay. We can go into it some more later as well if you have further questions. So on to the next slide, part 2 of the flags requiring action. So as Jennifer showed, one of the tools in Dart is a scatter plot of sulfur compared to sulfate. We've actually got them on different axes compared to the previous example. But one thing that we commonly review, is a great tool to start with, is comparing these two species because they are related, but they're also coming from 2 different filter types, analyzed by 2 different methods, but they're key species. So, you know, if you compare them, you're going to get some ideas of where they don't seem to trend very well together, and it could indicate issues with sampler, the sample setup, the analysis, or, you know, some unusual local event as well. So one good thing to check is that scatter plot and whether the ratio between 3 times sulfur divided by sulfate is equal to 1. Check for those outliers, and we have certain ranges in place similar to the AQS and null code and qualifier application value ranges. If the ratio falls outside a certain range that is based on historical values of the ratios, then the 5 outlier qualifier gets applied. And you can see that in the plot in the bottom right-hand corner. The red dots indicate outliers. So sometimes you'll see sulfate is higher than sulfur, and sometimes sulfur is higher than sulfate. And typically we see sulfur higher than sulfate, but not in all cases. It doesn't always mean there's an issue. So you want to check, is it reasonable data, compare with the carbon data, carbon measurements from the same site and date, and then any external data you might have, so the air now data. Check whether it's kind of a high concentration day, low concentration day, was it the sulfur or the sulfate that looks unusual, and then are there any comments on the filters to indicate there are any issues along the way up to this point to help investigate. So there's just some ideas, but the 5 qualifier will be applied when the ratio is outside a given range. So on the next slide, thanks. So again, this is just the final one on flags requiring action. So I've mentioned this one before, the AH null code. So the description for this is that the sample flow rate, or CV, is out limits. And this differs between the 2 samplers. So for the flow rate CV on the URG, so the quartz samples, if this value is more than 2%, the AH null code will be applied. And if it's more than 5% for the PTFE or nylon samples, the AHL code will be applied. So just in the quick plot on the left, you can see that this 89.1% flow rate CV is kind of throwing off the scales, but in both cases, whether this was a Teflon, nylon, or quartz sample, the filter would be invalidated. However, for the 3.3%, it would be if it was a quartz sample, it would be an invalid sample, but for the PTFE or nylon, it would be valid. So that's where some differences come in. And then on the right-hand side, I just tried to show a kind of a zoomed-in version that the flow rate CV does vary, but this one is varying below kind of 1%. So kind of the extreme ranges we have in the flow rate CV. So some things to check. The common things we've been seeing along the way is that sometimes the flow rate and the flow rate CV have been written in different boxes on the field sheet, wrong way round, and Wood is picking up on this quite a lot and is making that switch so you get used to the values that are expected for the two boxes, and so we'll typically change that and then apply the A1 change by Wood flag. So that's something to just double check when you're validating the data. And then another one is when the values are shown on the sampler itself and then recorded onto the field sheet, there's sometimes cases where the flow rate CV that's been recorded on the sheet is actually the standard deviation that's reported on the sampler. So obviously this means that we're getting a lot of valid samples for those flow CVs. Standard deviation is typically an order of magnitude lower. Yeah, just something to be mindful of when reviewing the data. If you're getting lots of 0.0 somethings, it might be the standard deviation that's being reported, not the flow rate CV. That was a little bit too detailed, so I'm going to switch paces and go on to the common flags not requiring action. So on this slide, given a few examples, but not all of them, but a flag that you'll commonly see is the MD flag. So I've tried to put this into a graphical form to explain what's going on. So we have the minimum detection limit that's calculated on a monthly basis using field blank data, and this is set for the whole network for a given species, and then the concentrations that are calculated for that species for that site and date. If the value is less than the reported MDL, then the MD flag will be applied automatically. So there's no need to take any action here. Of course, please review the data and compare the concentration value to the MDL. But we have automated flagging in those cases. So those ones should be good, and they should not be, the MD flag should not be removed. It's not making the data dirty. It's something to pass on to the end user so that they can be mindful of the data they're using. And then the FX filter integrity issue qualifier is typically added by either the sample handling lab Wood or by any of the analysis labs, and it's relating to observable issues. So I've tried to put in a few photographic examples here. So it's kind of hard to see without a pointer, but in the left photo, there's a tiny speck on the top left of the filter. So if this happens to be in the area that is analyzed by the lab, then it could cause some discrepancy in, compared to another area of the filter that gets analyzed. The lab will note this, apply the FX flag, and usually leave a comment as to what the filter integrity issue was. And the middle one, I think there's some dark staining towards the bottom right by the little barcode on there. And then the far right, I think this one was affected by moisture. So you can see that there's a uneven deposit across the filter, so there's some light patches and dark patches. Again, these might influence the end concentration on here. So always look at the detailed comments available for, when these flags are applied. So on the next slide, so similar to the FX flag, another observable issue is relating to matrix effect, so the MX qualifier. And this is primarily applied to the quartz filters, so the carbon species. And this is relating to a detectable influence by mineral particles on the quartz filters. So this MX flag might be applied to many filters, given location, depending on influences of, say, nearby industries or just the general composition of the atmosphere in that area. So we've kind of got a plain white filter on the right-hand side. This is a comparison to the two on the left. So we've got a pinkish one on the left, might indicate kind of an iron deposit, and then the middle one is more of a gray effect. And again, further details will be found in the comments. If you have any questions on that, we can discuss further. But those are applied by the lab, and so shouldn't be removed. Then a newish flag in terms of its implementation in the CSN is the LJ flag, which describes being the identification of analyte is acceptable, reported value is an estimate. So from the November 2018 samples onwards, this flag has been applied by the analysis lab based on analysis results. And it's applied because of the rotations and the termination of the organic carbon to elemental carbon split point in the analysis. And it's most often seen on the filters that have high EC concentrations, so, as well as heavily loaded filters. So, but know that in these cases, the quantification of the total carbon is still accurate. So you might start seeing them in November 2018 onwards. But it's something that we wanted to pass on to validators and to end users. So that's my bit done on what flags you might see, and hopefully Jennifer is going to describe how you can see those and change them in DART.
Yeah, exactly. So this slide is just showing an example of the batch data table for a few samples where that outlier flag that Nikki was talking about were applied. And so you see that here in the qualifier code comment and flag 5. And if you reviewed those and needed to make changes, you could click on those buttons to do that. Similarly, for this sodium sample here, you see that FX qualifier code has been applied.
Okay, so just back to some more of the data side and common things that we come across and often reach out to ask questions, see if we can pull more information together to provide evidence for any actions. Filter swaps is one of the ones that's kind of hard to pin down and resolve, but hopefully we can get there. And one of the first indications of a possible filter swap is through looking at the sulfur-sulfate time series. So I've highlighted two regions in this plot on the 19th of October and the 22nd. We kind of got this, I call it kind of a bow tie appearance in the data, with sulfur being lower on the 19th and then higher than the sulfate on the 21st. And if you imagine switching the sulfur between them, between those 2 dates, then the time series kind of line up a little bit better. So first step is that you can see there's an outlier flag applied to one of the dates, but not both, meaning that the ratio was out range for the 22nd, but it was okay for, it is there on the 19th as well, but not in all cases do we have that 5 outlier added, and so the comments will indicate that, and then you might also see some further comments if we've managed to find out anything prior to DART delivery. But some reasons behind how or why the data might appear this way relating to a swap is that the filter might get swapped in the field. So, it gets used in the wrong day, or the operational results are recorded on the wrong field sheet. So then some of the information gets mixed between the sampling days. The sample handling lab and the analysis lab can also accidentally put filters back in the wrong petri dishes, so physical filters get swapped, and they can be swapped between states, between sites, and with field blanks, so there's almost a misuse in the filter purpose. So a field blank gets sampled on and the sample does not get sampled on. Some of these are easier to spot than others. On the next slide, I think I've kind of tried to describe some more examples of how to go about maybe trying to investigate these swaps. So plot the time series shown below, the different time series. And if you want to work out, okay, which filter or which species of filter type has been potentially swapped between two dates here, you might want to compare with your carbon concentrations. Was it higher on the first day, and therefore in this plot the sulfate compared well to the carbon, but say the sulfur does not? And then suddenly on the next day, a low concentration day again, which one compares well? But don't stop there. If you've got other data that's compared to, again, to confirm some of these observations and add to the evidence, good. And then say if it was a sample and field blank swap, then you want to compare those two specific filters and to see whether, is the field blank concentration for sulfur higher or lower than the corresponding sample filter from that same day and same site. So on the next slide, you might want to toggle back and forth between those two. You can see that in this case, the issue was resolved. It was determined that the nylon filter was the one that was swapped between two dates, and so the changes were made, and the concentrations were updated, and we're able to see that the swap has been resolved, and that time series looks much more reasonable now, but the swap was definitely confirmed. So just one thing to note, that if the sample volume is changed in dark, that's one of the values, the operational parameters that you can change, that will be noted at UC Davis when we receive it back after the validation window is closed, and we will recalculate the concentrations for that given filter for the species once we have the data back, and then the data going to AQS will be updated and correct. So on the next slide, I think this is back to how you do this in Dart.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're seeing sort of a split screen here of Dart's approval mode, where at the top portion of the screenshot, you can see the tail end there of the batch data table, and you can see a sample there where the C1 qualifier was applied, which means that that was specifically called out as a review needed by the validators when the data came to Dart. And then you can see below that there on the time series, the sulfur and the sulfate are plotted, sulfur in black and sulfate in blue there. And this, the time series is similar to than what Nikki was showing, where you can use that as a tool to try and evaluate whether perhaps a swap had occurred, in which case then you could go into click that C1 button and leave a comment for the lab about what action that you would prefer to take there.
So another thing, I mentioned the field blanks and potential field blank swap in the previous slide, and one thing we do pay attention to is the field blank loadings, the mass loadings on these field blanks. because the field blanks are used to calculate values such as the MDLs, the minimum detection limits, as well to perform blank corrections on the species concentrations for the whole network. So it's just bearing in mind that if field blanks are not run correctly, then they could have an impact potentially on the whole network. So things you might want to look out for when it comes to the field blanks data is if they have high mass loadings, potentially the field blank was run with flow through the channel. And if the sample, in this example on the left, you can see that for sulfate, the mass loading for the field blank on the right-hand column is much higher than the associated sample. And so perhaps the sample did not have flow running through it, but the field blank did, so then it's a swap in filter purpose. So that's something that we can resolve and make clear that the field blank was run like the sample. It could be that depending on the part in the process that we're at, the field blank may have to be, or both the field blank and sample have to be invalidated because they're not representing the true purpose. In the middle example, it may be that the mass loadings and concentrations are actually similar between the two filter purposes, so that between the sample and field blank in the middle there, they've got similar sulfate concentrations, and so perhaps the field blank was run at the same time as the sample with flow through the channel, and in this case it appears like a duplicate sample, and we would have to invalidate the field blank, because again, it's not representative of a true field blank. We have had cases where the field blank concentration is actually still lower than the associated sample, such as on the right-hand side. But over time, this was still highlighted because comparing with previous field blanks from the site, but more importantly, compared to the rest of the network from that month and going back in time, this was still flagged as a high mass loaded field blank. And the operator actually determined that the channel that's used for the field blanks actually had a low flow running through it. So again, the field blanks had to be invalidated because they weren't representative of a true field blank. So I believe recently, and maybe we need to circulate again to the site, that field blanks have a certain protocol to follow, and to be a true field blank should be left in the sampler for the same duration as the sample is left in the sampler. I think there should also be caps and plugs to prevent issues such as the low flow through channels, so that the filter doesn't collect any deposits. We currently don't have any automated flagging or any commenting in place, so these are purely manually reviewed. So if you're able to do comparisons like this and find out some more information from the site, that's just something good to keep an eye on and report back to us as well. And then the next slide, back to Jennifer.
Yeah, so just real briefly, kind of highlighting that those field blank data are available in Dart as well, and can be interacted with in the same way as the regular samples. So here we're showing a few dates where there were both the regular sample and then also the field blank, and that's kind of designated there in the parameter name. And you can use the filter to search and find field blanks, as well as sorting. So
Okay, so we are nearly done. Getting to the Q&A part. We've gone through some of the big picture and detailed parts of the CSN data and suggested data validation techniques. Just going to finish with a few notes and points of information. And this slide is going to go over a couple of the date issues that we have in the CSN. Something to keep in mind when you're validating data, and maybe it's important to relay to site operators as well. So we have 4 dates available to us in the CSN for a given filter. There's an expected use date, which is based on the site sampling frequency. Then there's the intended use date, and this is actually generated at the same time as the physical filter. And then we have the actual run date and time and the end date and time for when the filter starts and ends running in the field. However, only one of those dates can get delivered to DART and AQS, and it's usually the run and date time. So hopefully, a lot of the information is incorporated, and it is the start time and the sample ran for 24 hours. But if that's not the case, then there's information that can be passed through by way of null codes and qualifiers. So if a filter doesn't run for 24 hours, then there's 2 criteria. If it's within an hour of the nominal 24-hour target, then the Y qualifier can be applied, and that's the elapsed sample timeout spec. And then if it's more than an hour, so less than 23 hours or more than 25 hours, the data is invalidated with an AG null code, the sample timeout of limit. So you can see the description of the qualifying null code are very similar, but one leaves the data valid and the other invalidates. So that's if it doesn't run for the full 24 hours. If the filter doesn't run on the intended use date, then there's a couple of things that may happen. The data may get flagged with the 2 qualifier, meaning an operational deviation. So this only applies to samples because we only have one field blank, and there's not necessarily a given schedule for field blanks. But just to note that the intended use date, the sample didn't run on the intended use date. If the filter ends up running on a different date, which happens to go into the next month, then it's possible that the data are reported as invalid because of the way that the CSN data is handled, that pathway, the batches, the month. So depending on when the filter actually gets sampled, it could essentially just kill the filter, unfortunately. And then if one filter runs on a later date than the intended use date, and then there was a sample that was actually intended for that later date, and so that does not run, or even if it does run, we can't have 2 sets of data for a given date at the site if it's the same, so if it's the PTFE filter that gets run, 2 of them on the same day. So to avoid these duplicate issues, because AQS won't accept it, we have to handle data in different ways on a case-by-case basis. So we will relay that information to you through comments. And then we also are trying our best for completeness purposes for end users. Is if a filter never gets generated by Wood, then we will populate the system to kind of have a placeholder for what was an intended or expected filter. So a case of this is where a sampler is down for repairs, so Wood stops sending filters, obviously to save resources, stop shipping filters to the site, so a record is never generated. There is never an intended use date created for that filter. So just know that our version of completeness here is different from completeness that Jennifer mentioned earlier. I think Jennifer can confirm, but the completeness in STI is relating to the number of invalid to valid samples rather than a missing data kind of completeness. So then I promised this is the final slide from me on the next slide, and this is just kind of a quick checklist of kind of suggested validation techniques. So things to check is consistency of the data in DART with your fields, chain of custody logs, check the null and qualifier flag applications, whether there's any comments or flags from any of the labs, check the invalid samples, especially if it's been erroneously invalidated If the data's there and available, it should still be reviewed. Look into sampling anomalies, the operational parameter values, field blanks, because it might have impact on the whole network data. If there's recurring issues, perhaps the sampler needs to be looked at, for example. Consistency with other measurements and historical measurements. And then we said this a couple of times, and as Jennifer's mentioned, how to do it in Dart is please write clear and detailed comments so that when we're reviewing the data before we deliver it to AQS, we really know what was intended and we can make changes accordingly without having to reach out and delay delivery times. The AM null code, it'd be nice to have descriptive. We have a lot of available code in the CSN, so something other than AM would be nice. Add qualifiers, there's room for 10. You don't have to restrict it to 1. If there's lots of information and lots of different bits that you want to pass on to an end user, then add qualifiers up to a maximum of 10. Only invalidate samples when there's a serious problem. And be mindful of the different filter types and different samplers for a given date. An invalidation may not apply to all 3 filter types. And then be careful when you're applying flags to multiple parameters. The bulk edit options available in Dart. Again, the comments will really come into play as to what you intended to apply flags to. And please get in touch if you have a question. We're here to help, and everyone's got kind of different knowledge on the data. So if you have a question about analysis, then again, reach out to us and we'll put you in touch with the people that give you a clear answer. And then next slide is just a couple of dates. We can leave this up here while we have question and answer if you like. But these are our anticipated deliveries to, so when you might be able to expect certain factors to be available in Dart, and then when we hope to be able to have the data in AQS by these are, the next one that we should be delivering is January to AQS, hopefully by Friday. Opening up the floor to the audience.
Yeah, you could type your questions into the chat box if you'd like, or you can ask the questions via the telephone. The other thing I noticed, Jennifer, is the bottom of the slides. Some of the slides were cut off in the view, so we are going to make these slides available. How are we planning to do that?
Yeah, we can. Well, we can certainly make a recording available via YouTube the way we've done in the past, and then we can send out an email with all of the slides as well.
Yeah, I think we should, because some of the notes on the bottom were cut up on the screen. So.
Okay, apologies for that. I don't.
Folks have any questions?
I can kind of kick things off. This is Jennifer still with a question that came in actually via email, but I'm assuming these folks are probably on the webinar also, but we'll reply via email as well. But the question was that if an instrument is malfunctioning, should the validators apply a null code to the calculated parameters, such as reconstructed mass, and would they also apply that null code or a different one to the operational parameters, even if those values were reading correct, but the rest of the analytical parameters for that sample were not correct because of the instrument malfunction?
I'm happy to answer that one. So the first question was about invalidating based on an instrument malfunction. Part one?
Yeah, it was kind of whether to invalidate those calculated parameters, which I think are not submitted, and then also whether to invalidate the operational ones.
So in terms of the calculated parameters, because the data is available in Dart, going back in time, even though the validation window is closed, yes, by all means, invalidate, because those values came from the concentration concentrations reported for the filters. So if the sample is having an issue and you were invalidating, say, the elements, then yes, the calculated parameters that use those elemental concentrations should naturally be invalidated, but the data don't go to AQS for the calculated parameters. They're in Dart to aid validation. So for your own record, you might want to invalidate them, but that's as far as those values go. So there's no need to focus on making sure that they're invalidated in terms of what goes to AQS. Regarding whether to invalidate operational as well as analysis results, it really does depend on the nature of the issue. So sample malfunction, yes, if the concentrations are going to be wrong because the filter wasn't running properly because of the sample issue, then yes, analysis value should be invalidated, but it depends on if we're able to, someone's able to determine what exactly the malfunction is. But from my knowledge, I would say that, say, it's just not running properly, it's intermittent, then can any of those operational values actually be trusted as being correct? So I would potentially invalidate everything as well. The only things that may not be invalid could be the ambient pressure and temperature. They might be kind of separate to the main sampler issue. But as you own the data, it's up to the validator to determine how they want to treat the samples. And as an end user, how useful is temperature and pressure if you don't have any of the concentrations? So kind of different ways of thinking about it.
And did we want to mention the data validation guide, the updated data validation guide that we're working on?
Yeah, so here's a list of various validation resources. We have a validation guide on the top there. We're currently working on an updated version to give you some more ideas on the do's and don'ts and suggested techniques. It's very nearly done, and we're hoping to be able to circulate to you all in the next week or so. So if you don't hear anything from us in the next couple of weeks, then please reach out and let us know, and we'll send you a copy. Otherwise, refer to the website, the Air Quality Research Center at UC Davis documentation, and we'll update there as well, so you're always able to download the latest version. Listed on this slide is a range of other resources available to you as well, from other past webinars, users guides, validation trainings that we've done at conferences. So hopefully it's a good set of resources to help you with validation, as well as the CSN support email address. There's people at the end of that as well.
We actually have this is Jason from Wisconsin. We have a current situation where we're dealing with a URG that's having a small malfunction that's causing the CV to jump above 5%. We're suspicious that what's happening is the pump isn't starting up initially, and that the first 15-minute flow reading is only partially with the pump running. For a situation like that, would you recommend invalidating the entire sample if the problem is isolated to just a brief period of time within the 24 hours?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we've seen this before, and again, so it's ultimately your decision on what you'd like to do or what you think would be reasonable. But if you've already determined that it is a very isolated problem and that the main 24 hours is okay, then I personally would think that it's okay to not invalidate the whole sample and maybe just that parameter. But we have the automated flagging in place, so depending on the actual value of the flow rate CV, it may end up getting invalidated before going to AQS anyway. Just so the data
I was going to say, this is Joanne, if the period of time where it's fluctuating, like how does that affect the overall CV, even though it's greater than the cut point? And if it's still within the criteria, then I guess you're good. And then you can, I think, look at also the total sample volume and compare that as well to see what the effect might be, and then make a decision from there.
That sounds good. I guess one other question as far as the URG goes is if we're looking for that more discrete flow data, can we pull that off the cards before we send them in, or can we request that data after the cards have been sent in?
It should be accessible through the actual keypad and the interactive screen. I'm not 100% sure of that, but you should be able to look at and retrieve all the, you're talking about flow CV information and total flow information?
Actually, I am, but I'm talking about more of the discrete data if it has that, has a 15-minute interval data.
Yeah, I don't know what's on the card, actually. We can follow up with you on that, but you could certainly download the data from the card before you ship it in if you decide to do that.
Okay. Appreciate the insight.
All right, we're getting close to running out of time and losing our lines. Does anybody have anything else they want to ask, either through the chat box or via phone? All right. Well, thanks everybody for attending and muting your phone lines for us so we can all hear. We'll be sending the slides out via email, I guess the PDF via email, to everybody that was on the original meeting notice list, so you can see the full slides, and then we'll, I guess, Jennifer, after we get this thing up on YouTube, we'll also kind of send the link out for that as well, correct?
Yep, that's right. So look for both of those coming from us soon.